Welcome back to Exotic Car Play Place, everybody. Thanks for joining in again. And today's the next part in the series of owning a supercar. What's the lifestyle about? Today's is actually shopping for your next new or used supercar. And what is that really like? Because there's a lot of variables that you need to understand. First of all, the car you're looking for. Where do I shop for it? How do I search it out? What am I looking for? Some of the hazards and the pitfalls that you need to be aware of, and how to go about getting that information. So that's very, very important. And then where's your next steps? Actually putting your money down and getting that car delivered to your house. Maybe you decide on a Ferrari, maybe a McLaren or a Porsche, whatever that looks like. You have your own decisions. However, much of these rules apply. And I'm going to walk around this Lamborghini and show you some of the things to consider with one of these cars. But of course, this really does apply to almost any supercar. You've got to understand the idiosyncrasies and the hazards and the concerns of any one of those cars. And they all have those Achilles tendons, if you will. So let's walk around and I'm going to show you some of the things you need to be aware of and how to look for them. But before we do that, the first thing you need to understand is, where do you buy these cars? Well, if you're in Canada or US, you have autotrader.com. In the US, autotrader.ca. There's one place. eBay, there's cars there. Be careful, buy at your own risk. Of course, you gotta make sure if you're buying online, you really want to make sure you get lots of pictures, video. Even better, if you have a friend that lives nearby that car or somebody that you can trust to go and do the checks that you need done for that car if you can't fly out there. What I would say is, if you're gonna spend $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 on a used exotic car, it's probably worth your time to grab a flight if the car is not local. Get down there, look for the hazards, figure it out, decide whether there's cosmetic issues, whether there's damage or problems, or it just doesn't show well. You sometimes can't tell that by picture, so be very careful when buying online. Make sure you always have somebody that can pitch in and do a quick check for you remotely. So that's one place. Another place is, if you're not looking at the traders or the eBays, there's lots of other options. There's lots of those guys out there that will headhunt for you and find the right car for you. Be careful with them too. Make sure there's a reputation, make sure they've got a track record, and make sure they're trusted. As well as any big city these days, for example, where I live here, even in Edmonton or Calgary, Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, doesn't even matter. You go down to the States, it's even better yet, especially as you go further south. Lots of options. You've got dealer networks, whether it's dealership specific, like Lamborghini factory dealer, or even if you get some of those third-party dealers. They can all be good options. You just got to make sure that they're trustworthy, they've got a good reputation, and that they supply you with the information that you need to make a savvy choice. So when you say savvy choice, what is it about? It's not just about the pretty paint and the great aftermarket parts they might have, or is it stock and original? Whatever you're looking for, that's all fine. That might suit your needs. But you got to make sure you do some of the other checks. And most importantly is you have to do a Carfax and or a car proof. Extremely important, because it tells you not just if the car has been in an accident, but it actually tells you where that car has been registered, not specific to the person's name, but it'll tell you if it was across country or it was down to the States, or American car went up to Canada and back. And sometimes it gives you a bit of a track record or a history as to what that car's been doing. If it's been changing hands a lot, that's maybe not a good sign. If it's maybe a 1 or 2 owner car and it's, they've had that car for a while, maybe not a bad choice. Either way, make sure you get the history through a car proof and a Carfax. Extremely important. So let's do a quick walk around and talk about some of the things specifically you want to look at if you go and do an inspection. And of course, this initial inspection is what I'd advise you to do. Do a walk around, look for the basics. But outside of that, always do a pre-purchase inspection. An absolute must do. And if you don't do that, you're really risking, you're hanging it out there, so to speak. You're taking a gamble. And unless you're getting an absolute steal of a deal, and I mean steal, so you almost have to assume the worst, clutches, a bunch of bad parts, brakes, the whole nine, add it all up. If those parts cumulatively is the discount, okay, maybe you can consider it. But if that's not the case, be sure to get a pre-purchase inspection. It's critical. So you've got a Carfax, car proof, pre-purchase inspection, and we're going to do a walk around, and I'll show you some of the things you want to look for. Let's go. So now I look at the Lamborghini here, and there's a lot of things that you have to consider. Now these cars are actually very, very reliable, relatively speaking, for supercars. So you always want to look at tires and the tread depth on that. You also want to make sure the brakes are good. Now here we've got steel brakes, so it's actually not that expensive. But if you have the carbon ceramic brakes, did you know a Ferrari ceramic brake change, like the pads, the discs, the whole nine, can cost as much as $40,000 Canadian. US, you're probably in that $20,000 to $30,000. Huge bucks, so make sure the brakes are in good shape too. Then you want to do a walk around. Look at the critical points, the areas. Do you have any damage? Do you have any door dings? I mean, you want to do a good sweep and do an inspection all over, right? Any damage. You also want to look underneath. Check under there. That's typical curb scraping territory. You want to make sure that that's not all gouged up underneath. So again, brakes, tires, and that you have no undercarriage damage. Again, as I say, these are areas, these supercars sit so low, and it's imperative that you look under the front bumper and you look under the rockers and here. Because these areas take a beating too. You can actually get lots of rocks kicking up, or somebody backs over something sharp, or you hit, back up to one of those curb stops, and you basically rip that off. I've seen these get damaged quite easily. Make sure everything is good cosmetically. Now another important thing to make sure everything's on the up and up. Open the door. Now you got to look down here. You'll find your VIN on the pillar here. So that's important that you get that information and that it matches up with your VIN right here. You want to make sure the VIN that's located here matches the VIN down on the sill. Very important to know that you don't have a car that's been pieced together, stolen, or what have you. You also want to make sure all the decals, the factory stickers and everything, again, that's a sign that maybe it had some body work. If some of these things aren't here or there's overspray, you want to make sure that you don't have overspray in some places like this, because these are areas that often either get masked or oversprayed if it's poorly done body work. You want to make sure that there's no issue there as well. And we talked about decals. Make sure all your factory decals are in place there, and on a Lamborghini they have them here, on Ferraris they're in other spots as well. So just make sure all your decals are in place, everything looks original, because if you're lacking some of these original factory decals and stickers, that's going to hurt resale sometimes because the car doesn't look complete. Is there any big oil stains or oil leaks, antifreeze issues? You definitely want to look down in between there. You can often see if there's lots of oil. Look underneath. See if there's any issue underneath the car. And ultimately, you're just looking for a general condition. And as well, you have to take the car out for a ride. Doesn't mean you have to drive it, because I understand not every exotic car owner wants you to necessarily drive their car, but you definitely want to get inside the car and go for a ride. Even if you're in the passenger seat, you can, ask them to do different things, some hard acceleration, some harder brakes. Take the hand off the wheel, make sure the car doesn't kind of swerve, pull hard to one side or another. Do different things, make sure there's no weird noises coming from the back. Could suggest rear differential issues or front differential issues on a sharp turn if you crank the wheel one way or the other, because most Lamborghinis are all-wheel drive. Make sure you have no weird clunkiness coming from the front end or the back end. Make sure on Lamborghinis there should be really no weird noise coming from in the engine. I mean, these cars are great for exhaust noises, of course, but you want to make sure that there's no excessive valve train noise up top, and you don't want to have engine knocks down here. Some of the early cars, the early Gallardos, for example, had rod bearings from a different supplier, and they would have a knock just prior to an absolute failure. So be careful that you're buying the right car. And Ferrari, same thing, they're high revving. It's not uncommon to necessarily find a car that's been over revved, raced, and now you have a problem. And another thing you got to be looking out for is windshields. Lamborghini windshields, Ferrari windshields, McLaren windshields, what do you think they are? They're not a jobber part you're going to get from crystal glass. This windshield here can cost as much as $6,000 or $7,000. And the worst part is if you take your car into the dealership, they'll order this windshield. It'll take 6 weeks to get it to the dealership. And literally every other glass that shows up, every other windshield that shows up to the dealer after an order shows up broken just because of mishandling. So sometimes it can take your car out of service because of a bad windshield. Again, the cost is very, very high, so you want to make sure that the glass is in good shape or you have really good insurance for that windshield. Another thing to be aware of with a lot of the McLarens, which you don't see here, but a McLaren, a lot of them, unless you'd like the 570s and that, don't have it, but if you're buying a 12C or a 650 or a 720, they have actuators all the way around, regulates the ride height and the stiffness of the ride to accommodate performance driving. But with that, unfortunately, sometimes those things give out and you'll have a problem, and the car will settle or sag, and those are very, very expensive on McLarens. And another thing that you have to recognize is cars like this is an e-gear car. You can see it's got the paddle shifters. You guys are aware of paddle shifters, e-gear car. So Murciélagos, Gallardos, a lot of these older cars have a single automated manual gearbox, for example, e-gear. Ferraris, the earlier cars, for example, the 355 has the F1 system, so does the 360, and as well the 430s all had the F1 system, which was very similar to the e-gear in this car. In other words, they were clunky and the clutches didn't last very long. So the clutch, in this case, happens to be, you've got the engine, you've got the tranny, and right in between is the clutch. You have to get what they call a snap test on these Lamborghinis. And Ferrari has another similar means because it's actually the TCU, the transmission control unit, and the Lamborghini and the Ferrari share similar ones, and you plug in and they tell you how much life is left on that clutch. If you have a manual gearbox like the gated shifters in the Ferraris, the 360s, 430s, Gallardos, Murciélagos, they're gated shifters. There's ways to check that mechanically. But on the e-gear or the automated manuals, like those cars that I mentioned, we'll have to do it electronically, and you'll definitely want to ask for that snap test. If not, the pre-purchase inspection will reveal that. Why? Because it can cost you $10,000 to do a clutch in this car, similar in a Ferrari 360 or 430, and it just goes up from there. So now we'll talk about some of the newer cars like the Huracans and the 12C McLarens or 650, 720S McLarens, the Ferrari 458 Italia and newer 488. A lot of those cars now have dual clutch transmissions or some sort of derivative or their version of that. So dual clutch transmission is really little or no maintenance involved. It's more of a dry setup. It's not a conventional automatic transmission. There's a whole lot of technical behind it, but it's more robust and likely does not require the amount of servicing that a single automated gearbox like this has. So those are a lot easier to deal with. You definitely want to make sure that the engine is up to snuff and everything else is as well. So everybody, I really hope you enjoyed the video. Again, as always, hit the subscribe button, and more importantly, you want to see last week's video. If you missed it, right over here, click that link. If you want to see a review on this car, that link over there. Hope to see you guys soon. Catch you then. Bye-bye. So I'm not gonna lie, I love driving this thing. This never gets old, ever.